Hi everyone. In this video, I'm going to go through some of the basics of processing and Java, including variables, conditional statements, shapes, and colors. Before starting this, if you do not already, I recommend that you go to processing.org and download and install processing so that you can follow along. Before we get started, let me first introduce you to Java and processing. So what is Java? Java is a high-level, class-based, object-oriented programming language. It is also a strongly typed programming language because every variable must be declared with a data type. And Java is also a very common programming language to be used and also to be taught. Processing is an IDE, or integrated development environment, which means that it is used for writing code. It is also a graphical library, which means it's very useful for displaying visuals. And it also includes some additional classes for simplification, and it has improved readability over using Java in a more traditional way. Traditionally, processing uses Java, although newer versions have been introduced that use JavaScript and Python. So let's dive right in and get started. Typically, as programmers, the first thing we do when we are using a new language is we test it out with a hello world print statement. So I'm going to type print, open parentheses, hello world, and end quote, end parentheses, and add a semicolon at the end. Java, it's important to end your lines of code with a semicolon so that it knows that is the end of the line. And if we hit run, we can see in our console down here at the bottom, it prints out hello world. This is one of the first things that people typically do with a new programming language. This familiarizes you with the print statement of that language. In Java, it is print, open parentheses, quote, hello world, end quote, close parentheses, and semicolon at the end. Even though nothing else is happening right now, this is actually still running, so we can also hit stop to stop it from running. Now let's try using some variables. So I'm going to get rid of the print statement, and instead I'm going to make a new variable, which is going to be of type int or integer, and I'm going to name the variable x, and I'm going to assign it a value of 100. Int is a number type of variable, and so this variable x needs to have a whole number that is assigned to it. So I am setting it equal to 100. And now I can use that variable to do things to it. So I could say, for example, update the value of x. And when you're updating the value of a variable, you can also reuse that variable. So I could say x times 2. And we always end our lines with a semicolon in Java. So what this is doing is this is taking the variable x and it is updating the value of this variable to whatever x was before times 2. Now we can see the result of this by printing our x variable, just like we did print hello world a moment ago. And then we just hit run, and we can see the result that is output is 200. If we wanted to see what x was before we applied this operation, we could add another print statement in between these two. Print x again. And now something interesting is going to happen here. When we run this, it is printing both values, the 100 value first and then the 200 value, but it's actually printing them on the same line. If you are only printing one thing, a print statement with just the word print will print just one thing. However, if you're going to be printing multiple things, you probably want them printed on separate lines. So if you add ln, so now it's print ln, so what this is doing is it's adding a new line character after each print. So now when I print this out, I get 100 and then 200. Next, let's try a string variable. So I'm going to get rid of my print lines. I'll go ahead and leave my int x up here. And I'm going to add a new variable, which is going to be a string. This is a string of characters, so this would be text. And I'm going to name this season. And so we're just going to say we're going to keep track of what season it is. It's summer right now while I'm recording this, so I'm going to set this equal to summer. And remember to add a semicolon at the end. You might notice the little squiggly line underneath both season and x. This is to let you know that you are not using this variable anywhere. So it's giving you a little warning that you've created a variable and then never using it. So let's go ahead and use our season variable. So we'll do print line season. And now you'll notice the squiggly line went away for season because now we are using it, but the one for x remains. One other important thing to note is that string, the s for string is capitalized while the I for int is lowercase. It is cap sensitive, so it's important to type those correctly. And so now if we run this, it will print out the season that we're storing in that variable, which is summer. Next, let's try using a conditional statement. This is very common in programming to do some logic on the things that you are working with. So a conditional statement typically is an if statement or an if-else statement. So we're going to add, actually I'm going to get rid of this print line, and I'm going to write if open parentheses, and a conditional statement, that means it is checking some condition. The condition goes in parentheses. So what this says is if this thing in parentheses is true, then we're going to do something about it. So let's say if season is winter. Now, a couple of things here. First, so what I'm doing is I'm comparing this variable season. I'm comparing it using two equal signs. Earlier we used a single equal sign, so that is for assignment. Two equal signs is for comparison. So we are saying, are these two things equal, true or false? And so we put in quotes here, winter, and so it is going to compare whatever is in this variable, which right now is summer, and it's going to compare it to winter, and it's going to say, are these two things the same? And then if it is true, now we have an open curly bracket, and I'm going to go ahead and put my closed curly bracket right away. So Java uses curly brackets for conditional statements, among other things, but it uses it for conditional statements, and then whatever is inside of these curly brackets, that is what it will do if this condition is met. So if this condition is met, I'm going to say print line, it's cold outside. And I'm putting this because this happens if our season is winter. So we'll end parenthesis and add a semicolon at the end. Now, if this is not true, then we can add an else, which will happen. The else will happen if this statement is not true. So if season is not winter, then we're going to come in here in this else block, and we'll say print line, it's not winter. So now if our season is winter, it will print it's cold outside. Otherwise, it will print it's not winter. And if we run this right now, we will see it's not winter being printed out. If I change my season right here to winter, now it says it's cold outside because this is being met. Now, again, capitalization is important. So if I set this equal to W, lowercase w, winter, and run this, now it's going to say it's not winter because this comparison is failing because of the lowercase w here. One other thing is if I started this equal to summer and at some point I update the value of my variable, being a variable means its value can change. So if I update this value to winter somewhere later in my code, and now if I run this, now it is coming into this if condition and it is saying this is true. So even though I originally set it equal to summer, when I update the value, it's using the new updated value in this condition. All right, so that's the basics of variables and conditional statements. So now let's move on to look at shapes and color. One of the great things about processing is it's very visual. So the output that you're creating, you can see right away what you are doing. So I am going to get rid of all of the code we've written so far, and I am going to make a rectangle. Now, if you were to draw a rectangle in real life, you maybe have a pen and a paper, and first thing you need to know is where are you starting drawing? Where at on the paper are you going to start your drawing? And how far are you going to go in each direction? So what is going to be the width and what is going to be the height of that rectangle? And in processing, the program needs to know the exact same information. So we give it the command rect to tell it to draw a rectangle, and we first need to tell it where do we want the rectangle to start, and this is going to be an X and Y coordinate, and then we need to tell it how wide and how tall it should be. So I am going to say this rectangle starts at 0, 0, so that is X equals 0 and Y equals 0, and then I will give it a width of 50 and a height of 40. Now, if you're drawing a rectangle on paper, another thing that you might be interested to know is what color is the rectangle. So right now, it will just be a default color. I'm going to go ahead and run this so we can see what happens. And here we have this tiny little window has popped up. and it has in it a rectangle, and the rectangle starts at 0, 0, which in processing, 0, 0 is actually the top left corner. So x equals 0 is the farthest to the left x position, and y equals 0 is the closest to the top position. And if you have a positive y value, it will be lower on the screen. If you have a positive x value, it will be farther to the right. So we can shift this rectangle a little bit to the right and a little bit down. Let's say our starting x is 10 and our starting y is 20. And now if we run this, we can see the rectangle is now a little bit lower and a little bit further to the right. And it is the same width and same height as it was the first time. Now it is a default color, which is white. And like I said, if we're drawing a rectangle, we might want to know what color is the rectangle. And when we're programming, things are executed in order from top to bottom. And so if we want to specify a color, we actually have to specify that color first before we draw the rectangle. And if we want to give it a color, what we'll do is we'll use the word fill, and then in parentheses we tell it what color to be. And this color is an RGB value, red, green, blue, and each of those colors is between 0 and 255. So for example, if I say 255 for the red value, and then 0 and 0 for green and blue, and remember to add a semicolon at the end. Now if I run this, I have a red rectangle. Instead of having 255 for red, if I move that over to blue, now I have a blue rectangle. And if I were to say use 255 for green and for blue, now my color is cyan. So we specify a color first and then we draw a shape. Any other shapes that we draw after this one will continue using that color until we change the color. So for example, if I draw another rectangle and let's say move this one a little farther to the right and a little further down, and I will make it also a little bit larger, just slightly larger. Now I can see I have two rectangles. Now one thing that's important to note is, again, it is executed in order from top to bottom, and this also determines the draw order. Newer things are drawn on top of what was already there. So this bottom rectangle is the last thing that is drawn, so it is actually drawn in the front. If I want it to be a different color from my first rectangle, I can change the fill value, and here I could do 255 for red, 255 for green, and 0 for blue. And now I have a yellow rectangle, and the yellow rectangle is the last thing drawn, so it is in front. Another shape that is useful to be able to draw is an ellipse. Just like with a rectangle, an ellipse needs a starting x and y value and a width and a height. Separate from the rectangle. So with the rectangle, it actually starts in the top left corner of the rectangle and it draws the rectangle to the side and downward. The ellipse actually is the center point of the ellipse, is the x and y value that we give it. So if we give this 0 and 0, it's going to draw the center of the ellipse in the top left corner of the screen. And then again, we give it a width and a height. Let's make this ellipse a little smaller. So we'll do 30 and 20. And let's go ahead and make our ellipse a different color just so it's easier to see. I'll make this one green. So you can see the ellipse is in the top left corner of the screen, so the center of the ellipse is being drawn in that corner. So if I wanted to position this farther to the right and farther down, I could add some value to my x and my starting x and my starting y. So let's start it at 50, 50. And now my ellipse is closer to the center of this little window. Now this window is very tiny, so the next thing we're going to look at is how to set up our window. And to do that, we're going to use a function. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of the code that we have right now for these shapes and colors, and we're going to set up our window. And to do that, we are going to use a function called setup. And in Java, we use this keyword void to indicate a function that does not return anything. So functions can either return a value or they can return nothing. Void means that it returns nothing. and a function does something, and it does it in a way that we can then call that function, and that function happens at a specific time. The setup function in processing is designed to run once at the beginning of the program when it is first launched. And so you can specify things that you want to happen just once, right away, right at the beginning. And when you're writing a function, another thing in Java is we use open and close parentheses for the function. And then if you were to pass a variable to the function, that would go inside of those parentheses. However, we're not going to pass anything to setup. We'll use an open and close curly bracket, just like we did with the if statement earlier. And so now inside of these curly brackets, we would put whatever code we want to happen first, right at the beginning when we launch our program. And one of the first things that most likely you'll want to do is set the size of your window. So I'm going to set my size to 400, 500. So that's the width and the height of the window, and that with a semicolon. And another useful thing is to set the background color of your window. So I'm going to set my background color to 100, which will be gray. Now, just like with the fill, we could pass it an R, G, and B value, just like we were doing before. But if you only pass a single number, it uses that number for all three values. So it's going to use 100 as the red, the green, and the blue values. If I run this right now, all it's going to do is create an empty window with a gray background, and this window is 400 wide and 500 tall. So now we have our window set up with the setup function. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add a draw function. So again, it starts with void. It's not going to return anything. We use open close parentheses and open and close curly brackets. And so setup is to run once right at the beginning to set up your window, and then draw runs to draw whatever you want to draw on the screen. And processing is intended to be used for somewhat interactive things or things that are going to change over time. And so draw is going to run 60 times per second. So you can think of this like a frame rate, like for a film or an animation or a video game. And so the frame rate is going to be by default 60 frames per second. And so draw is going to run continuously. It's going to run over and over and over again. And so you can update what you are drawing to the screen. But for now, we're just going to draw a single thing like we were drawing before. So I'm going to say fill, and we'll do 255. 0, 255, and then we will draw a rectangle, and let's put this at, let's say 100 and 100 for my starting X and Y value of my rectangle, and then let's say our width is 120 and our height is 60. And now we have a magenta rectangle being drawn, and it's starting this corner at X equals 100 and Y equals 100, and then it is 120 wide and 60 tall. Now, since we are specifying the size of the window, we can now actually use the size of the window for positioning things, which is really useful. We have the built-in keywords width and height to represent the width and height of the window. And so what we can actually do here is we can set the X and Y position to half of the width and half of the height so it is centered. So we could say width divided by 2 for the X value, and height divided by 2 for the Y value. And now it is starting this corner in the center of the screen, which isn't great because I actually want the whole rectangle to be centered. And so now we're going to actually combine what we've learned so far with shapes and colors with what we learned previously about variables. So I'm going to make a variable for the width and height of the rectangle. And we're going to put that outside of the draw function. Typically, we'll actually put them at the top of our file. So I'm going to go up here above setup. So we create our variables out here so that we can use them in multiple places. So I am going to create I'm actually going to create a float variable. This is a new one. So an int was a whole number. A float means that it is still a number, but is a number that can have a decimal. So I'm going to say float W, and I am going to specify And I'm just using a float value in case I want to make changes to this later, if we wanted to divide it and change the size or shape of our rectangle, so it could now have a decimal value. So this variable, which I'm calling W, I'm going to set it equal to 120, which is the width that we are using here. And I'm going to make one for the height, so we'll use H. We can't use the words width and height because those are already keywords used for the width and height of the window. But we can use the letters W and H. And now here, instead of these numbers, I can replace these with W and H. And now what's useful is when I'm positioning this rectangle, I want to go to the center of the screen and then adjust it based on the width and height of the rectangle so that I can put the rectangle itself in the center of the screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract W divided by 2. And for my Y value, I'm going to subtract H divided by 2. Now this is getting kind of long, so it can start to get a little confusing. So what you want to look for is the commas. The commas are the important thing here. So if we look for the first comma, everything on this side of the comma, this is the starting X value. And then everything between this comma and the next comma, that is the starting Y value. And then we have the width of the rectangle and the height of the rectangle after the next two commas. And now our rectangle is actually centered in the screen. Now I mentioned that this draw runs every frame. This will be really useful later if you want to be able to move things around on the screen. One last shape I want to show you how to draw is a triangle. So I'm going to change my fill color when I draw the triangle. So we'll make this green. And a triangle has 3 points, and then it will draw lines connecting those points. And so we need to pass it an X and Y value for each point on the triangle. So let's say we want to start the triangle we'll start on the far left side of the screen. So we'll start with X equals 0. And let's actually start at the bottom left corner of the triangle. So this will actually be the bottom left corner is 0, height. So that's the height of the window. And remember, the larger the Y value, the closer we are to the bottom of the screen. So 0, height, this will be the bottom left corner. Then let's make this triangle go up to the center point of the screen. So this would be width divided by 2 and height divided by 2. So remember, we're doing pairs of numbers. So our first pair of numbers is our X and Y of the first corner. And then we have the X and Y of the second corner. And now we need the X and Y of the final corner. And so I'm going to position the final corner in the far right-hand bottom corner. So this will be width is the far right-hand side of the screen. And then height is the bottom of the screen. And now if we run this, we can see we are now drawing a triangle that has two corners, one in each of the bottom corners of the screen, and then its final corner is in the middle of the screen. So now you know how to draw rectangles, triangles, and ellipses, and you know how to change the color of each shape and how to position them around the screen. If you want to get a little bit of practice with this, what I recommend doing is try using those shapes to make some kind of picture of something that you are interested in, maybe a character from a video game or just something from your imagination. But try making something, you could have a reference image open and then you're trying to match that reference image just to get a little bit of practice with positioning different shapes on the screen and changing their colors. I hope you found this video helpful to get started with Java and processing. Thanks for watching.